Hey, good morning. Okay, so we did not plan this on the calendar, but it works, it eerily works that the topic that we're up to this morning, because I wanted to go over part 3 of Origins of Totalitarianism, is where Hannah Arendt writes about the totalitarian state and basically the evils of concentration camps. And we've scheduled, and we're actually talking about that on the eve of Yom HaShoah. Sometimes these things just happen, right? was not planned that way. But we are up to part 3. If you read or want to read, there is one chapter from part 3 of Origins of Totalitarianism that is in the portable Hannah Arendt, and it is the selection that's called Total Domination that they have starting on page 119. So that is one of the sections at the end of part 3, and I'll let you know when we get to that section. So if you have this, you can read it at home. But I want to go. This is like the culmination of the book. So I selected a few passages to share, and we'll go over them here as best as I can in the time we have. One of her main points, and sorry, I need to turn off my phone, it's making noise. Off. Okay. Is that in a totalitarian state, she tries to make the point that a totalitarian state, to describe it systemically, right? And one of the original ideas of her project is that she's comparing the totalitarian state in Nazi Germany with Stalinist Russia. And looking at the comparisons there. It's, as I said before, it's not an even comparison because she's not a scholar of Russian history and she doesn't have any facility with Russian language. So she's dependent on reading things that are available in either English or German, whereas because obviously she's German, so she has full facility of reading whatever the primary sources that were available at this time, which was only, in a decade or so after the end of Nazi Germany that she was able to read. So she knows more about Nazi Germany than even Russian scholars knew about Soviet Russia, because a lot of that material wasn't unsealed until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Nevertheless, she is, and I think one thing we've seen throughout this series is that she's brilliant, right? And that she's very prescient. She can see what's happening, and whether she's able to prove it or not, it's over time we see how many of her insights come true and are shown. So but the comparison of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia is she knew that would not be an uncontroversial comparison. The basic similarity that she argues that these are new types of states that had not developed before. They're not just authoritarian. She says authority is a political idea that goes back to Roman times, and an authoritarian state limits individual freedom, but it does not abolish individual freedom. It circumscribes it. Whereas in a totalitarian state, there is no individual freedom. There is no individual autonomy. And the essence of the totalitarian state, she tries to argue, is that the individual is superfluous. The individual is just not important. And that's the main idea that kind of runs across. It's the connecting thread that runs through her analysis of what makes a totalitarian society. So I'll read you the few passages I find. This is on page 3. I'm going to give you the pages from the main, on 311, from the original Origins. Only where great masses are superfluous or can be spared without disastrous results of depopulation is totalitarian rule, as distinguished from a totalitarian movement, at all possible. So you need great masses, and that's also why you don't have them in earlier periods of history, because you need a huge population, where in the post-industrial age there's this population boom, right, in world population. So in older, in medieval times and ancient times, populations were not superfluous. So you couldn't afford to lose mass numbers of people. the way that the Nazis and in Stalinist Russia, that they would murder millions of people, lives were taken, and it didn't, and you would still have a German population, or you still have a Soviet population. So that's her point there. And then this part, this is in her analysis of just basically the society that sets the grounds for totalitarian rule. Let me just read this here. It was characteristic of the rise of the Nazi movement in Germany and of the communist movements in Europe after 1930 that they recruited their members from the mass of apparently indifferent people whom all other parties had given up as too apathetic or too stupid for their attention. The result was that the majority of their membership consisted in people who never before had appeared on the political scene. And that's, so what I wrote in my margin as I was reading this, I wrote, basket of deplorables. Because that was both Hillary Clinton's insight and terrible, terrible tactical error, right? In that she understood that the mass of people that her opponent, that Donald Trump really were a different type of population, right? It wasn't the traditional Republican voting bloc, but by dismissing it as basket of deplorables, that basically was, kind of the history. We know what happens after that, because this is, if you have a portion of the population that has the right to vote and is being told that you are not important, you are forgotten. That's exactly what the movement of which they're coming apart is. That's exactly what's energizing their movement, that they are being ignored, right? And that they want to vote for this, they want to be a part of this new movement that is suddenly not ignoring them. And Hillary Clinton basically set that up, right? When she said you're a basket of deplorables. Now, I'm not comparing any American voters to the German populists in the 30s or Communist bloc, but it's saying, and she says that there are, she's not making the equivalencies, but you're talking about what establishes when certain movements can start, and that's a basic ingredient, is her point there, that it takes advantage of people who are generally were not political actors before. And that's when we call it, what's what we mean by a populist movement. Right? And that's how the Nazi movement began, as a populist movement. And then talks about here, Hitler's greatest achievement, now on page 324, in the organization of the Nazi movement, which he gradually built up from the obscure crackpot membership of a typically nationalistic little party, was that he unburdened the movement of the party's earlier program, not by changing or officially abolishing it, but simply by refusing to talk about it or discuss its points, whose relative moderateness of content and phraseology was very soon outdated. So what she's saying is that it starts off with ideology, but then it moves away from ideology. That it was that Hitler took over the small party and used the apparatus to increase his power. But the things that the Nazi party, the platform, the things that it stood for, were kind of pushed aside. And then he compares this also to what happened in the Soviet Union. She writes the end of the same paragraph, the fact that the most perfect education in Marxism and Leninism was no guide whatsoever for political behavior, that on the contrary, one can follow the party line if one repeated each morning what Stalin had announced the night before, naturally resulted in the same state of mind, the same concentrated obedience, undivided by any attempt to understand what one was doing, which was also expressed in Himmler's ingenious watchword for his SS men, which the watchword of the SS men were supposed to say, meine Ehre heißt Treue. My honor is my loyalty. It's just that it's not based on principles. It's just based on loyalty to the leader of the movement, and it basically transitions into that. And that was the idea, which said that he was able to move that. I want to do the screen over there instead, so to figure out how to face it there, because I don't want to block the arc. So, yeah, yeah, okay. No, it's fine. And this idea of blind loyalty to the leader, which is a key element, right? And that's the comparison with Hitler and Stalin. And she says, 331 now, they were satisfied with blind partisanship in anything that respectable society had banned, regardless of theory or content, and they elevated cruelty to a major virtue because it contradicted society's humanitarian and liberal hypocrisy. So it's also a revolt because it's based on this sense of the forgotten masses. So the movement uses the forgotten masses to object to the elite leadership society that ignored them. And then that's what leads to also cruelty and any other, and just disregard of any of the values that were normally accepted in what was considered normal society. Because part of the problem was normal society, because they were excluded from normal society. So that's again, part of what she's doing is mapping out what are the ingredients that leads to totalitarian movement taking power. This is from 333. To this aversion of the intellectual elite for official historiography, its conviction that history, which was a forgery anyway, might as well be the playground for crackpots, right? This idea of disregarding of facts. Must be added the terrible, demoralizing fascination and the possibility that gigantic lies and monstrous falsehoods can eventually be established as unquestioned facts. Right? That it eventually, not only history tells it wrong, those are just the elites, and then eventually this faith in falsehoods. That man may be free to change his own past at will, and that the difference between truth and falsehood may cease to be objective and become a mere matter of power and cleverness, of pressure and infinite repetition. Not Stalin's and Hitler's skill in the art of lying, but the fact that they were able to organize the masses into a collective unit to back up their lies with impressive magnificence exerted the fascination. So it's a very important point there. It's not just that they were skilled liars. The more important, because there are a lot of people that are good at lying. What was particularly unique about Hitler and Stalin was that they were able to energize and build movements of people who believed in their lies and were willing to put history and facts aside. And the new definition of truth is not that which can be shown dispassionately through evidence, but rather that which can be said with more force. Right? That if you say something with force, then you believe it, and that contagious belief in statements coming from the leader is what energizes this type of movement. Moving now to 3. Now in 338, she talks now that we should understand. This is the point that is going to be fleshed out in Eichmann in Jerusalem, which we'll spend the last 2 classes after today talking about. There's this very strange idea she has of what she means by the banality of evil. Because you're going to talk about radical evil when she talks about concentration camps. I'll give you a passage about that. But she's saying that what was Himmler, who was the head of the SS, who organized the SS, Himmler was the one who put together the machinery, the human machinery for the execution of the final solution, right? So, and the people that he put together, and this is the part to keep in mind, that they weren't who you would think were mass murderers. No, he says, he proved the supreme ability for organizing the masses into total domination by assuming that most people are neither bohemians, fanatics, adventurers, sex maniacs, crackpots, nor social failures, but first and foremost, job holders and good family men. That the mass man whom Himmler organized for the greatest mass crimes ever committed in history bore the features of the Philistine rather than of the mob man. And nothing proved easier to destroy than the privacy and private morality of people who thought of nothing but safeguarding their private lives, right? And that's all that he did. He got regular people, normal people, to do these terrible things, and that's also a part of the element. We talk about, someone who's a serial murderer, right? Your average SS man was not a serial, I mean, it was a serial murder because they murdered millions, people. But the personality type is not something, their backgrounds were not serial murderers. Their backgrounds were just regular people. And that's what makes it so scary and makes the evil so more disturbing. And that's what she means by banality of evil when she talks about Eichmann. That people says, oh, you're defending Eichmann. She says, I'm not defending Eichmann. I'm accusing human beings because it's the fact that he was just a regular, very boring guy that could do such terrible things. That's the scariest part about the history of the Holocaust. Moving to page 348. What is the mass leader? The chief qualification of a mass leader has become unending infallibility. That's what makes the mass leader, that he can never admit an error. Can't admit to be wrong. And because if the mass movement is based on the faith and the force of the leader's statements, the leader can't be wrong. And then she writes, page 350, before mass leaders seize the power to fit realities to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such. Right? So that's the first step. That propaganda is not just trying to convince people, but it's just contempt for facts. The facts are not important. For in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of man who can fabricate it, right? And that's the first step there. And then and the idea that what is that? So if you're believing people move by facts that are not based in reality, then it leads her to the next point in her argument on page 352. In other words, while it is true that the masses are obsessed by a desire to escape from reality, because in their essential homelessness they can no longer bear its accidental, incomprehensible aspects, it is also true that their longing for fiction has some connection with those capacities of the human mind whose structural consistency is superior to mere occurrence. The masses' escape from reality is a verdict against the world in which they are forced to live and in which they cannot exist. Since coincidence has become its supreme master and human beings need the constant transformation of chaotic and accidental conditions into a man-made pattern of relative consistency. Okay, this is what makes Hannah Arendt such an extraordinary thinker, is that she's trying so hard to understand, right, how seemingly ordinary people can bring forth such a terrible disaster and catastrophe. And that's the point, that's the whole point of the banality of evil, right? The argument that it's not that these were ex-murderers, that these are normal people. So what happened? And then she's trying to understand what happened. She's trying to think through the mindset of the German people, right, who allowed someone like Adolf Hitler to come to power. And her argument is exactly what I was talking about before. It's the basket of deplorables argument. She's saying that these are people who feel, right, who feel that they have been, they want to escape the reality of the world because they find the world to be cruel to them. So that's why they latch on to lies, right? Because the lies offer an escape from an inhospitable world. And the lies and the movement helps them to construct a different kind of world in which they're not victims and they're not homeless anymore. And she uses the word homelessness, which is an extraordinary sense of her pathos, of understanding where it's coming from, because her whole experience is an experience of homelessness, right? She's the one that they kicked out, right? She had to leave her country and she becomes stateless. But what she's arguing here is that the German masses who became a part of the Nazi movement, they also felt homeless in their own country. And that was what Hitler and the Nazis were able to use that and manipulate that, to coming to power. Yeah, Linda. Did she distinguish between totalitarianism and fascism? Yes, because fascism can't apply to communism, because communists are anti-fascist. So by using the term totalitarianism, she's applying the same principles to Stalinist Russia, where you you can't call that fascist because it's a because it's technically because that's the opposite. But it's kind of what I was saying yesterday in my sermon, that when you have the extremes, the differences between the extremes ultimately become inconsequential, right? So, I mean, and that's the thing, right? The fascism and communism are opposite extremes of the political spectrum. It's the far right and the far left. Yet what she's saying is phenomenologically, they're really the same. And in terms of the effect of the cruelty that can come from it, the catastrophe is the same. Yeah, David.
Besides the ability to get ordinary people to do terrible things, wasn't there this big area of complacency where ordinary people didn't stop bad things, didn't complain about
Yeah.
bad things?
Right, but that's because once we'll get to that. Once the totalitarian movement takes power, then it's then able to control its population through terror. And then it's harder. I mean, some people do, right? Some people do. And I'll just jump ahead, right? When at the very end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, when she explains why it was right for him to be executed, she says that he may have been a boring person, but he did terrible things. And there are other examples of, and she points to a German soldier named Anton Schmidt, who did everything he could, saved a few hundred Jews until he was caught and executed. And she said the fact that there are people like Anton Schmitz is what tells us that people like Adolf Eichmann do not deserve to live. So she recognized, but those are few, right? Because the mass population is going to give in to the terror of the structure of the governing structure. Jane.
I just want to point out, I actually was reading Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
I got a fair amount through it. I'm not finished, but one of the things that struck me in the retelling of Eichmann's role was, boring as he was, and, quote, insignificant, and not even very capable,
Mm-hmm.
was this urge for power and influence.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed to motivate Eichmann a great deal. And what also came through, I mean, I know I'm jumping ahead, but it's sort of, in a way, not contradicts, but it's another perspective on this point that you're
Mm-hmm.
making about the banality of evil, is that the German governmental structure was so fragmented and compartmentalized. There were all these competing factions. It was really very confusing. And that I think a lot of the time, and especially in the beginning, people didn't really necessarily understand what they were even doing, but they saw it, like Eichmann saw this as a
Right.
career opportunity.
Right.
And so one of the things that's a little bit missing from your narrative is here is the, this it's not only stateless or homeless or dispossessed. It's like, this is my chance. I'm not dispossessed, but
Right.
I am given this opportunity.
Okay, well here she's talking about the masses of the people, not the Nazi actors here. But I think you could apply the same thing, that I think from that mass of people, the sense was this political movement is their chance now to correct the injustices of where they are in the world. So it kind of connects that way. So, yeah, okay. Anyway, let's say, we've got two days back in Jerusalem. Let me get into here. So I'm up to page 385. The outstanding negative quality of the totalitarian elite is that it never stops to think about the world as it really is and never compares the lies with reality. Its most cherished virtue, correspondingly, is loyalty to the leader who, like a talisman, assures the ultimate victory of lie and fiction over truth and reality. So again, that's re-arguing the basic structural point of the force of the leader over factuality. And then the end of that chapter on the totalitarian movement, her last sentence is, in a totally fictitious world, failures need not be recorded, admitted, and remembered. Factuality itself depends for its continued existence upon the existence of the non-totalitarian world. Right? Factuality is only a thing. If there's a non-totalitarian world. In the totalitarian world, it's irrelevant, because the only truth is what the leader puts forward, and that failures are not discussed. And this is true in Stalin's Russia as well as Hitlerite Germany. Those are not discussed. The only thing that's presented to the people is the success and the truth of the leader's vision. Okay, so then we move along. Her next chapter is called Totalitarianism in Power, which then goes to how it controls. So now I'm up to page 392. Totalitarianism in power uses the state administration for its long-range goal of world conquest and for the direction of the branches of the movement. It establishes the secret police as the executors and guardians of its domestic experiment in constantly transforming reality into fiction. And it finally erects concentration camps as special laboratories to carry through its experiment in total domination. So 3 elements of the totalitarian state, right? It's this apparatus of the state is for pushing the movement through the rest of the world, conquest, right? And the secret police is for governing its own people and pushing through the lies of the state. And then the concentration camps are a laboratory. The concentration camps are a laboratory for the experiment of total domination. And then she'll get into that. She's going to explain what she means by that. And she goes through each part, right? So she first talks about the apparatus of the state, which I won't spend as much time on, and then the secret police, and then the concentration camps. So on page 412, the reason why the ingenious devices of totalitarian rule, where their absolute and unsurpassed concentration of power in the hands of a single man, were never tried out before, right? Why is this a new thing? Because no ordinary tyrant was ever mad enough to discard all limited and local interests, economic, national, human, military, in favor of a purely fictitious reality in some indefinite, distant future. Yeah, she said that it's the reason why the ingenious devices of totalitarian rule, with their absolute and unsurpassed concentration of power in the hands of a single man, were never tried out before, is that no ordinary tyrant was ever mad enough to discard all limited and local interests, economic, national, human, military, in favor of a purely fictitious reality in some indefinite, distant future. This is her understanding of Stalin and Hitler, right? Because they're working against the interests of their own country, right? They make decisions that go against what's in their economic best interests of their countries, against the military, strategic best interests of their country, because they're driven instead by a purely fictitious reality. And that never happened before, that someone as mad as that would put their own vision on top of the actual needs of their own state, of their own people. That never happened before, and that happened with both Hitler and Stalin. Yeah. That is her argument. She sees.
I don't know if that's true, 'cause I'm not that smart. Number one. Number two is that if you take the criteria that you outlined, it would suggest that the rise of communism in China is different than the rise of communism in Russia. Because one could argue that in China, the changes that they made were in the best interest of their country.
Yes.
Versus in Russia where they weren't.
Yes. Yeah, and so whether or not it's true there was never a totalitarian state before, she's defining what totalitarianism is, right? It wasn't, her definition, and that's why she structured it as, she shows it as an outgrowth of the rise and fall of the nation state, global trade, imperialism, that's why she. Right, so her point is that it couldn't exist before. It exists only when you have these superstructures where it's sort of where industrialization has brought us to this point where, so she's giving it's not to say there wasn't tyrannical regimes before, although she does argue that she believes that there was nothing that was that cruel in history before, is her argument. Yeah.
into slavery. I'm not so sure that was in their best interest.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
I question that.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I had the same like visceral reaction when I'm reading Hannah Arendt. It's like, is it, there's sort of a temptation when you're looking at recent events to see it as different from anything that happened before, and especially when you live through it the way that she did. So that, and there's only so much that she can take a step back and says, are these patterns that repeat, or is this something different? She is making the best argument she can that this is something different, that what happened in the 90s and 30s and 40s is the worst thing that ever happened in human history, and that's the argument she's making.
it also sets a construct by which to measure the totalitarian states which have followed.
Right, right.
Cambodia.
Yes, yeah, and if we get to the end, she also says that these are the things to watch out for. Exactly. Linda and then Jane. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. 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 You didn't have, you could have a populist revolt where they would take up arms, but through the legal means, and she points that elsewhere, I didn't select it, but she said what was also unique about the Nazi movement is that it came to power through fully legal means, and that's also unique about it. That doesn't work for the communist Russia, because there was a revolution. There was no revolution that brought the Nazis to power. They won an election. So, yeah, Jane and then Barry.
That's just what I was going to
Yeah.
say, in response to your comment, is that actually communism did come about. It wasn't a product of Stalin.
Yeah, right. But and that's why, so like you could connect the Chinese communism, you could maybe compare it with Lenin, right? But Stalin is different, right? Because she says she sees Stalin as something as phenomenologically different. Right, and her point is it's not about communism, Stalin, it's about Stalinism, right? Yeah, Barry.
Make a quick comment and a quicker question need not be answered. My mind keeps trying to imagine if Hannah Arendt were here today, what would she be saying, what would she be doing? And I use that as being as reference to the past, but we're now in the future. And from my personal view, what happened in 1930s Germany is happening in the United States of America today. It seems almost a carbon copy.
Mm-hmm.
What would Hannah say if she were here on the today?
You said it need not be answered. So you said it need not be answered. The question was, what would Hannah Arendt say today? I don't want to answer it because Hannah Arendt she refused to be pigeonholed politically. Like she said, I'm not a leftist, I'm not a rightist, and she always surprised people by what she said. So we can all come to our own conclusions on that. Yeah. So as she makes an interesting point that the totalitarian leader acts as a conqueror even in their own country as well. That's why they're acting, it's sort of their own, they're not always acting in the best interests of their own country. The totalitarian conducts himself everywhere as though he were at home. He must treat his own population as though he were a foreign conqueror. And this is the economic, the draining of resources. It says, for economic purposes, the totalitarian regimes are as much at home in their countries as the powerful swarms of locusts. So right, she compares them to locusts and how they're just destroying their own country. And it's incredibly powerful to her because she, as someone who was a citizen of Germany, right, to see what happened to Germany, what the Nazis did to Germany is behind that comment. Moving to 434. Now she's talking about the secret police. She says, in totalitarian countries, all places of detention ruled by the police are made to be veritable holes of oblivion. Right? That's how the secret police, it's not that they're secret. It's that when they arrest you, everything is secret after that. They're holes of oblivion into which people stumble by accident and without leaving behind them such ordinary traces of former existence as a body and a grave. Compared with this newest invention for doing away with people, the old-fashioned method of murder, political or criminal, is inefficient indeed. The murderer leaves behind him a corpse, and although he tries to efface the traces of his own identity, he has no power to erase the identity of his victim from the memory of the surviving world. The operation of the secret police, on the contrary, miraculously sees to it that the victim never existed at all, right? So it just erases them. And that's where she makes the point that it's not like a criminal. With a criminal, there's a record, right? And there's a reason why the person is there. When the secret police nab you, it's as if you weren't ever there, and that's a different. So it's worse than murder. It's worse than imprisonment, right? Worse than persecution. It's erasure. And that's where she makes the point. It's making people superfluous, that they're just eliminating them. So she writes later on 443, murder is as impersonal as the squashing of a gnat. Right? And it's interesting because she uses locusts as an analogy for the Nazis themselves, but she says here, when they murder their own people, it's like squashing gnats, so there's no consequence. And that's what she calls radical evil. And that's the distinction. And a lot of scholars who've written about Hannah Arendt try to understand what the difference is between radical evil and the radicality of evil and the banality of evil. And the best way to understand it is that the totalitarian structure, concentration camps, the idea of concentration camps, of making people superfluous, that is radical evil. That is hell on earth. The people that then do it and engage in it is the banality of evil. And that's the distinction that they can be brought in to this radical evil, and it's a distinction that's very complicated, but that's kind of where. But the roots of it, people look to Eichmann Jerusalem. It's all in Origins of Totalitarianism if you read it carefully. Jumping to page 446, she says, the propaganda of truth. If the propaganda of truth fails to convince the average person because it is too monstrous, it is positively dangerous to those who know from their own imaginings what they themselves are capable of doing, and who are therefore perfectly willing to believe in the reality of what they have seen. Suddenly it becomes evident that things which for thousands of years the human imagination had banished to a realm beyond human competence can be manufactured here on earth. That hell and purgatory and even a shadow of their perpetual duration can be established by the most modern methods of destruction. To these people, and they are more numerous in any large city than we like to admit, the totalitarian hell proves only that the power of man is greater than they ever dared to think, and that man can realize hellish fantasies without making the sky fall or the earth open, that you don't need supernatural means to bring about hell on earth. And that's part of her understanding of the totalitarian state, that it stands for the idea that anything is possible. She uses that phrase all the time, that anything is possible, brings the state to the radical evil. And then in comparison with the insane end result, the concentration camp society, the process by which men are prepared for this end and the methods by which individuals are adapted to these conditions are transparent and logical. The insane mass manufacture of corpses is preceded by the historically and politically intelligible preparation of living corpses. The impetus and, what is more important, the silent consent to such unprecedented conditions. That's what David was saying, like when people allow this to happen in society. Suddenly and unexpectedly made hundreds of thousands of human beings homeless, stateless, outlawed, and unwanted, while millions of human beings were made economically superfluous and socially burdensome by unemployment. This in turn could only happen because the rights of man, which had never been philosophically established but merely formulated, which had never been politically secured but merely proclaimed, have in their traditional form lost all validity, right? And that goes to her point that we talked about in last classes, that she says that that's where the failure of human rights, of the French Revolution idea of the rights of man, because you're saying every human being has certain rights, but only so far as there's a state that guarantees them and protects them. Without the guarantee and protection of a state, they're nothing. And that a stateless person has less rights than a criminal, because a criminal is still acknowledged by the state. The stateless person is superfluous. And that's the structural problem in our, in the way that human society works. So she says the first essential step on the road to total domination is to kill the juridical person in man. And that's why she says criminals do not properly belong in concentration camps, if only because it is harder to kill the juridical person in a man who is guilty of some crime than in a totally innocent person. Right? Criminals weren't put in concentration camps, they were put in prisons. Concentration camps was for the superfluous, was the people that weren't convicted of any crimes. They were just ridden out. And that's the evil, that she talks about, the true danger there. The gas chambers, only because of their enormous capacity, could not be intended for individual cases, but only for people in general. You don't build a gas chamber for individual criminals. Just build it for people. And that's the distance, and that's why it's not murder, it's not persecution, right? It's making people superfluous. Here, the aim of page 451, the aim of an arbitrary system is to destroy the civil rights of the whole population, who ultimately become just as outlawed in their own country as the stateless and homeless. So here she makes an important jump. She says she, as a victim of the Nazi state, because she becomes homeless and stateless, she says it's not just something that happened to me because I'm a Jew. Every German became stateless and homeless that lived under the Nazis, because ultimately the state didn't protect any of its citizens. It made it, and then the next decisive step in the preparation of living corpses is the murder of the moral person in man. And this is done in the main by making martyrdom for the first time in history impossible. Here it's an extraordinary passage of what's new. What's new in the extermination of people in the Holocaust that didn't happen before is that it eliminated the opportunity for martyrdom. I'll read you later. It says, the Western world has hitherto, even in its darkest periods, granted the slain enemy the right to be remembered as a self-evident acknowledgement of the fact that we are all men and only men. It is only because even Achilles set out for Hector's funeral, only because the most despotic governments honored the slain enemy, only because the Romans allowed the Christians to write their martyrologies, only because the church kept its heretics alive in the memory of men, that all was not lost and never could be lost. The concentration camps, by making death itself anonymous, making it impossible to find out whether a person is dead or alive, robbed death of its meaning as the end of a fulfilled life. In a sense, they took away the individual's own death, proving that henceforth nothing belonged to him and he belonged to no one. His death merely set a seal on the fact that he had never really existed. That's chilling. And that's why when we read that, and that's what it tried to do, it's what makes things like we do tonight, like having a Yom HaShoah commemoration, that much more important, because it establishes the martyrdom that the victims were not able to have in their own deaths at that own time. Right? And it didn't exist. When she wrote Origins of Totalitarianism in the 1950s, there were no Holocaust memorial services in the 1950s. Right? They really were anonymous deaths. And not that we can put names to them, but we try to. But we can, in a sense, give meaning. That's what we try to do with Yom HaShoah services. We give meaning to deaths that at the time had no meaning. And that was the cruelest part about it, that they had no meaning. The whole idea of, in Judaism, martyrdom is called Kiddush Hashem, sanctification of God's name. It can only take place if someone's there to witness it. Yeah.
I thought the Germans kept meticulous records of everything.
Yeah, but only for themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And then try to destroy them when they
Yeah,
say that they
right. Yeah, they kept records, but not to memorialize the victims. They kept records just a part of the bureaucratic functioning. That's all. Yeah. Nadine. Right. 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 Right, that Elie Wiesel is saying was able to put forward that idea of Yom HaShoah as bearing witness. But her point is such a powerful point because he didn't have it at the time. When people, when soldiers die in a war and a struggle, they're immediately honored. and that was, there was no meaning to the victimhood, and so, but we can still establish it now, right? And that was, what Elie Wiesel's great work was, and I think his he called it some bearing testimony, is what he referred to it as, which you didn't have yet when she wrote this. Yeah. So here, the 456. It is in the very nature of totalitarian regimes to demand unlimited power. Such power could only be secured if literally all men, without a single exception, are reliably dominated in every aspect of their life. That's why it's called total totalitarianism. In the realm of foreign affairs, new neutral territories must constantly be subjugated, while at home, ever new human groups must be mastered in expanding concentration camps, or when the circumstances require, liquidated to make room for others. In the framework of a totalitarian ideology, nothing could be more sensible and logical. The inmates are considered vermin, right? They just get rid of them. It is logical that they should be, if they're considered vermin, then it's logical they should be killed by poison gas. If they are degenerate, then they should not be allowed to contaminate the population. If they have slave-like souls, no one should waste his time trying to re-educate them. Seen through the eyes of the ideology, the trouble with the camps is almost that they make too much sense and that the execution of the doctrine is too consistent, and that's what's so chilling about it. Ideologies are harmless, uncritical, and arbitrary opinions as long as they are not believed in seriously. And many, many times, she doesn't like ideologies. So it says ideologies, when politics becomes ideology, that's when politics become dangerous. Right? Because her understanding of politics is the engagement and the argument over issues. But when you come with an ideological position, when you come with an ism, you're standing with an idea before you're even engaging with a discussion with anyone else. And that's when it becomes dangerous. Once ideology's claim to total validity is taken literally, they become the nuclei of logical systems in which, as in the systems of paranoiacs, everything follows comprehensively and even compulsorily once the first promise is accepted. The insanity of such systems lies not only in their first premise, but in the very logicality with which they are constructed, the curious logicality of all isms, their simple-minded trust in the salvation value of stubborn devotion without regard for specific varying factors already harbors the first germs of totalitarian contempt for reality and factuality. So we talk about what are the steps that leads towards totalitarianism. She says the first step is when people believe in ideologies. And that's why she refused to call herself a liberal, a leftist, a rightist. She said, let's just debate issues. Because that's what Greek politics in ancient times, that was what democracy was supposed to be. But when you have an idea, call it communism, Nazism, whatever it is, you have an idea and you say, this idea gives me the answer for all things, that everything that I see in the world is explained through my ism, then that puts a wall against any interchange with any other view and leads you ultimately towards blind following of the leader of that ism. Yeah, Sherry. I have not. Uh-huh. Yeah. I haven't read him. I should. I don't. It's worth looking at. Yeah, thanks. Okay, I'll take a look at it. Yeah, David. And then I have only 3 more passages I think we can do in 5 minutes we got left. Yeah.
Isms include organized religion, and Judaism,
Not really. No, because Judaism is all different ideas. But if you take one, if you take an ism, what she would say is like political Zionism, right, where you understand and that was her argument within the Zionist movement, because she saw herself as a Zionist too. But she said, when you understand everything in the world as good for the Jews, bad for the Jews, they're against us, and everything refracted through that understanding, then it leads towards problems. So that's where she would apply it. But it's not anything as an ism. I mean, the Christianity, it's, yeah. I don't think you call Judaism is not an ideology, Yeah, but not all organized systems are ideologies. So it's when the ideology is organized into a movement is when it can go down this direction. So, okay, so page 459, she says, totalitarian solutions may well survive. Okay, and this goes to Barry's point, right, about what would you say about today. This is a very important sentence. Totalitarian solution, and this is the end of the chapter, Totalitarianism and Power, which is, I think, the one you had here. Totalitarian solutions may well survive the fall of totalitarian regimes in the form of strong temptations, which will come up whenever it seems impossible to alleviate political, social, or economic misery in a manner worthy of man. Right? So when there is misery, but when people come up with solutions, tempted to come up solutions in manners that are not worthy of man, that's her high moral standard. Right? We want to come up with worthy solutions. When you come up with cruel solutions, right, and there's the temptation to do that, that's always going to be there. And it's always going to be something that we should be mindful of. I just have two more things that I wanted to share that I flagged. No, three, I'm sorry. So here, ideologies in general. She writes, ideologies, isms, which to the satisfaction of their adherents can explain everything and every occurrence by deducing it from a single premise. That's her definition of an ideology-ism, are a very recent phenomenon and for many decades played a negligible role in political life. Right? The whole political isms is generally a new thing, like you can date it to the middle of the 19th century. You know, where it wasn't a part of discourse in ancient or the medieval times. And then there we go. And here, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist. Okay, that's strongly powerful. And that's, again, goes to banality of evil. It's not the diehard Nazis who really believe in Nazi ideology, because Nazi ideology wasn't that. Hitler just used it as a starting point. It's not the diehard communists, the Marxists. It's the ones who lose the distinction between fact and fiction, the difference between true and false, right? It's those people, it's the common people that are the most dangerous and are the key for totalitarian systems to gain power. And then the last thing I just is from the end, the last page, 478 and 479. She says, what prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world, right, in our world, is the fact that is loneliness, is what she calls it. Loneliness, she explains, let me back up. She says, loneliness is the experience of being abandoned by everything and everybody. That's what the loneliness is. Loneliness is not solitude. Solitude requires being alone, whereas loneliness shows itself most sharply in company with others, right? So being lonely has nothing to do with being solitary. You can be solitary and not be lonely. You know, lonely is when you feel abandoned, and you can be with a group of people that feel abandoned. And then what prepares men for totalitarian domination is in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience, usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions, like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. And that's why part of her argument for the structure of totalitarianism is a new thing in history. That's why she says it can't exist before industrialization, because it's the mass industrialized society that creates the circumstances for mass disaffected, lonely people that you can't get in a medieval society where everyone lives in close contact with everyone else, right? Part of the whole things of like postmodern movement is, you know, in bringing people more closer together in villages and centers and stuff, is that idea of connecting with other people, because the modern society is so impersonal, right? And in a sense, it's even getting worse. You don't even have to go to a mass distribution store anymore. You can just order whatever you need from your computer. So that sense of abandonment, right, is what she says. And then there remains, and this is the very end of the book, there remains also the truth And here she ends with a positive, right? There remains, we're just finishing, thanks. There remains also the truth that every end in history necessarily contains a new beginning. The beginning is the promise, the only message which the end can ever produce. Right? Beginning, before it becomes the historical event, is the supreme capacity of man. It's identical with man's freedom, guaranteed by each new birth. So it says at the end that it's not the end of the world, right? That once something ends, you always have something new. And that whenever every new person is born, there's a new opportunity. And it's almost messianic, the sense of faith that she has in humanity, which is why the huge tome biography of Hannah Arendt by Elizabeth Young Burrell, she subtitled it "For Love of the World," and that's how she wanted to crystallize Hannah Arendt's argument that she's not a condemnation of the world; it's for love of the world. That's what drove so much of what she did. All right, we have a Hebrew music class taking over because they were kicked out of the Kiddush room because the blood tribe is there. So we're rotating rooms today. So I don't remember when the next date is, but whenever it is, we'll then start talking. We have 2 more to talk about Eichmann, Jerusalem. See you tonight here at 7:30. Thanks. I know, I told you in front of